the silent pandemic nobody's talking about. In 2020, the world came to a standstill because of a virus. Governments committed trillions. Scientists worked around the clock. Borders closed. Within months, vaccines were being developed, tested and administered on a scale never before seen in human history. Whatever one thinks of how that crisis was handled, the response was at least proportionate to the perceived threat. People were dying. Something had to be done. I want to put a different set of numbers in front of you. In England alone, in the year 2024 to 2025, 92.6 million antidepressant items were prescribed to an estimated 8.5 to 9 million identified patients. Not 9 million prescriptions, 9 million people. That figure is 29% higher than it was in 2015 and more than 40% higher than it was in 2020. Across 18 European countries, consumption of antidepressants more than doubled between the year 2000 and 2020. In the United States, 1 in 6 adults takes a psychiatric drug. These are not the statistics of a problem that is being brought under control. They are the statistics of a problem that is accelerating. Now consider suicide. In England and Wales in 2024, there were 6,190 registered deaths by suicide. That is approximately 17 people every single day. Suicide remains the leading cause of death in men under 50 in this country, and men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. In the United States in 2021, 48,000 people died by suicide, 132 every day, making it the 11th leading cause of death overall and the 2nd leading cause of death among teenagers. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates that more than 700,000 people die by suicide each year. To put that in context, at its worst, HIV/AIDS in the United Kingdom was responsible for around 400 deaths per year. Both HIV and COVID-19 were rightly treated as emergencies, attracting enormous resources, scientific mobilization, and sustained political attention. Yet suicide, year after year, quietly kills far more people in this country than HIV ever did, and it does so with a fraction of the institutional urgency. The World Health Organization has calculated that depression and anxiety cost the global economy $1 trillion every year, predominantly through lost productivity. A report by the Mental Health Foundation and the London School of Economics found that mental health problems cost the United Kingdom economy at least £117 billion annually, equivalent to approximately 5% of GDP. And yet, when you go to your doctor with symptoms of depression or anxiety, and many of you watching this will have done exactly that, you will be asked a series of questions. You may be prescribed medication. You may be referred for cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a useful tool for managing symptoms. What you will almost certainly not be given is an explanation of why you feel the way you feel. Not because your doctor is indifferent or incompetent, but because, by medicine's own admission, the underlying cause of most mental illness is not fully understood. The NHS states plainly that whilst antidepressants can treat the symptoms of depression, they do not always address its causes. CBT, for all its genuine utility, helps you recognize what you are thinking and how you might respond differently. It does not address the question of what generated those thoughts in the first place, or why the same patterns keep returning. The NHS itself acknowledges this limitation. It simply does not say what the underlying causes are. Now, one might reasonably assume that if anyone is well placed to understand the causes of mental suffering, it is the professionals who have dedicated their careers to studying and treating it. But here the picture becomes rather more complicated and rather more revealing. A review of research published in 2025 found that in one medical centre operating exclusively for healthcare professionals, 89% of psychiatrists who sought treatment were struggling with mental health issues. A Medscape survey found that 42% of psychiatrists and mental health professionals report high levels of burnout. Multiple studies have found that between 60 and 62% of psychologists report having experienced clinical depression at some point in their lives, and that among those with depressive symptoms, 42% had experienced some form of suicidal ideation. These are not marginal figures. They describe a profession in which the majority of practitioners have personal experience of the very conditions they are employed to treat. I raise this not to disparage those individuals, many of whom are doing extraordinary and difficult work under very considerable pressure, but to make a specific observation. If the professionals with the deepest theoretical knowledge of mental illness and the greatest access to its treatment are themselves afflicted at these rates, then something is clearly incomplete about our current understanding. The tools available to psychiatry are evidently insufficient, not because psychiatrists lack intelligence or dedication, but because the field is, by its own design, confined to what is physically measurable, chemically adjustable, and empirically demonstrable. And the root cause of most mental suffering, as I intend to argue in this series, does not fit neatly within any of these categories. This is where we find ourselves. A pandemic, and I use that word deliberately, that is growing year on year, that is economically devastating, that is killing people, and whose root cause remains officially unresolved. I began thinking seriously about this some years before I wrote the book from which this series is drawn. I was motivated partly by intellectual curiosity, but also by direct personal experience, my own, and that of people close to me. There is nothing abstract about mental illness when you watch someone you love disappear inside it, or when you experience it yourself. I know what it is to live in a state of near constant anxiety. I know what it is to present a composed face to the world while something quite different is happening inside. Most people watching this will know exactly what I mean. What I found over years of reading, thinking, and, if I'm honest, suffering, was that the root cause is not mysterious at all. It has been identified, described, and addressed in some of the oldest written documents in human history. It is present in the Torah, in the Synoptic Gospels, in the Quran, in the Tao Te Ching, in the Upanishads, in the writings of the Buddhist tradition. It was analysed by Aristotle. It has been confirmed in its broad outlines by some of the most distinguished neuroscientists and physicists of the 20th and 21st centuries. The reason it has not entered mainstream medicine or psychiatry is not because the evidence is absent. It is because the thing itself, the root cause, is not measurable in the way that medicine requires things to be measured. It cannot be isolated in a laboratory. It cannot be quantified in a clinical trial. And in a world where what cannot be measured cannot be monetized, what cannot be monetized tends not to be studied. The root cause of most mental suffering is something that every major spiritual and philosophical tradition has had a name for. Modern psychology has its own name for it too, though it uses it somewhat differently. That name is the ego. Not the ego of everyday speech, not arrogance or vanity. Those are just symptoms of it. Something more fundamental. The mental image each of us constructs of who we are, what we are worth, what the world expects of us, and what we stand to lose if we fail to meet those expectations. That image is entirely a product of the mind. It is not who we are, but most of us have spent our entire lives believing that it is. And the gap between what the ego demands and what life actually delivers is the source of virtually all fear. And fear in its many forms is what we call stress, anxiety, and depression. That is the argument I intend to develop in this series. It's not a comfortable argument in places. The ego, as I will explain, is very reluctant to be examined. But I want to say something clearly before we go any further, because I think it matters. This series is not an exercise in despair. I'm not going to spend 12 videos confirming your darkest suspicions about the human condition and then leave you there. The reason I wrote the book from which this series is drawn, and the reason I wanted to make these videos, is not to add to the sum of human despondency. It's because I have experienced, directly and personally, what becomes possible when the root cause is understood and addressed. I no longer live in the state of anxiety that once defined much of my daily experience. That is not a boast, and it is not a claim to have arrived at some perfect or permanent state of enlightenment. It is simply what happened, gradually and with considerable effort, over a number of years. And I believe, on the basis of that experience, and on the basis of what the oldest and most serious traditions of human thought consistently teach, that it is available to anyone who is willing to look clearly at what is actually going on. The ancient traditions I will draw on have a word for the turn from one way of experiencing life to another, from the life lived in the ego's service to the life lived from something deeper and more durable. The word is Metanoia. I will come to it in detail later in this series. For now, it's enough to say that the turn is real, that it has been made by countless people across thousands of years of recorded human experience, and that it begins precisely where we are beginning, with the willingness to look honestly at the ego and to understand what it is doing. In the next video, I want to begin with the ego itself, what it actually is, where it comes from, and why it is so difficult to see clearly in ourselves, even when we can see it plainly in others. I am Paul Kolberg. This series is drawn from my book, EGOdemic, The Silent Pandemic of Our Minds. I hope you will stay with it.